everyone. Welcome to our talk. So this is Felipe and my name is Konrad. I don't know whether all of you guys know me, so just some sentences about me. So I'm with Netcentric since the beginning. I actually hired Valdez. No blame for that. Yeah. What else might be interesting? So I'm a member of the Apache Software Foundation. So I'm committer at the Apache Sling project. Apache Sling is one of the pillars of AEM. I do have quite some experience with AEM. I counted, now it's 12 years. So I've seen a lot, and we want to share something we learned from previous projects, basically. And I hope there's something in it for you as well. Just to say, there was a very great talk by Natalia. Is she here? And this would be kind of the complimentary talk. So if you missed Natalia's talk, please look that up afterwards. It was good. Okay, we want to cover basically AEM component programming, but we want to concentrate on the editing aspects of it. So not really how the component appears to the end user, but rather how it feels like and how it behaves for the editor. So, okay, let's see whether we can get it to work. Yes. Hopefully most of you have experienced this or a very similar problem in the past. I think this is very common, and hopefully you can solve the problem once we are done with our talk. That would be the hope, at least. This is about a component not being editable at all. Then other problems are that the overlay, which is kind of crucial for an editor to actually enter the edit dialog, that this is placed at the completely wrong situation or wrong position, sorry, or not visible at all. This is just some examples. Some more follow here on the slide. I hope I guess you experienced something very similar in your previous projects. So this talk is for developers, definitely, but both back-end as well as front-end. So there should be something in it for both competencies. So we structured the talk that we start with the server side, so more for the back-end developers, and then I hand over to Felipe, who's covering more on how this markup is being interpreted on the client side to actually render all that fancy UI. And then we're gonna follow up with some configuration and best practices. So let's start with the server side. So I picked one component which is maybe familiar to you. This is a very simple title component from the WCM core components. So this component is actually used in the retail, and this just renders a headline. And this thing you see around that is obviously the overlay, which highlights the component, and then the edit bar on top. So that's how it should look like. So let's see. If we have a closer look at the markup, what is actually being generated to have that kind of appearance. So let's look at that. And this is kind of surprising because it's much more than what we anticipated. And if we compare that with what is actually in the Sightly script for the title component, you see this is not matching. So what you see in the title component is that basically only one element. In this case, H1. Can you tell me why this is actually rendered as H2 here? So there's a data slide element which changes that element here to H2. But it's only one element which is actually being rendered by the script, right? And there's a lot more being generated by AEM. So the question is, who's responsible for that? Because in some cases, this might have some effect on my styling and might even destroy my component. So let's look at the lines one by one, basically. So the first line is not being generated by the HTML script. So what is it? It is a so-called decoration tag. And what follows afterwards is the actual component's markup, and then is a very weird line containing only HTML comment. I don't want to go into detail here because it doesn't really affect the rendering of the component. It's just for logging purposes. So what you find in there is timing information, how much milliseconds it took basically to render the component, as well as some exception in case the component could not be rendered completely. This is being evaluated in the so-called developer mode in AEM. And the last part is actually the most important one. We want to focus on this part in this talk. And this is the so-called component context epilog. So let's have a look at which code is responsible for actually emitting that markup, which is not being written by ourselves, or in this case by Adobe in the Sightly script. So there are basically two Servlet filters involved, which enrich the markup. So one is the called WCM Component Filter, and the other one is the debug filter. As I said, we want to focus here on the component filter. The debug filter is only the comment part, so you can ignore that for the moment. What I want to highlight in here is that Servlet filters allow you to prepend something to the actual response as well as append something, right? So you can do something before the actual component's markup and afterwards. So let's have a closer look at the WCM component filter. So what this component filter does is actually it emits certain parts of what we have just seen before. So the most important part is definitely the component context epilog. But let's go at that one by one. So the first part which is being rendered is the decoration start tag. And the decoration start tag is then also properly closed at the end. So in between is your actual component's markup. You have to notice though that the that the decoration tag is optional. So it's not always being there. It could be that you look at a component where this decoration tag is not being emitted. I come to that in a second. Then what follows afterwards is the component context prologue. I made that a little bit gray because that was only relevant in the classic UI. It's no longer in the touch UI. So I hope you don't need to work in projects still leveraging the touch, the classic UI. But I know some clients are still on that very old UI. So, and then follows the actual markup of the component, and then there is the epilog as well as the decoration end tag. One important thing I have to remind you about is there is a property you can set which is named CQ no decoration, and this is a very confusing name, at least to me it is, because when I first read about that, and actually I don't know whether that is documented at all, but when I first read that property name, I thought, okay, this is most probably preventing only the decoration tag from being emitted, but in fact it prevents also the component context epilog, and we'll see that then the component is basically not editable, so the overlay is not being rendered at all. So to be honest, I couldn't come up with a good use case where you should set CQ no decoration to true. Just don't do it. So let's have a little bit a closer look at the no decoration tag. So actually the behavior changed a bit. So back in the bad old times where we still used JSPs and stuff, the decoration tag was mandatory. So it was always being emitted by AEM automatically, and there was no way around that. With HDL, and especially since 6.3 CFP1, the situation changed a bit, and this is no longer emitted by default. So you have to explicitly configure that to have that emitted. What is the actual purpose of the decoration tag? So the actual purpose is that this tag carries crucial information about, for example, the layout. When you think about the responsive grid. I don't know whether you worked with that. So that's basically an enhanced paragraph system which allows you to configure certain styling. So you say you are in a grid system and you want to span your component, for example, 4 columns of the overall 12 columns, something like that. Then there is a mode for that so that the editor can really do that. So this is now a configuration thing. And this is encoded actually in CSS classes which are being contained in the decoration tag. So there are some very good use cases where you cannot actually prevent the decoration tag from being emitted, especially if you're talking about components which are directly included in a parsers or in a responsive grid. One more remark about that. So the WCM core components, so the core components are really the reference components which are shipped now with AEM, and I really recommend using that and or at least having a look at how they're programmed because they're now the best practice. So all those configure actually a decoration tag, so they all rely on that feature. Yeah, I said already the decoration tag by default is not emitted, but there are 2 ways to actually enforce the decoration tag to be emitted. So one would be you just configure it in the component explicitly, and the other one would be it's kind of enforced by the container. So this is done for responsive grid and parsers. This is kind of new to me as well, to be honest. So I developed 12 years of AEM without having a real clue about decoration tags. But it's good to know about that, basically. And it's good to also see, okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages about using decoration tags versus not using it. Adobe decides to use it in the WCM core components, and so do I recommend that to use that for all our existing components. Big disclaimer, I don't use it yet in my current project because I just figured that out very recently. The big pros are there are less diffs being emitted in the effective markup you see, and you are much closer usually to whenever you have like an agency delivering static HTML, you just have to implement it in AEM components. So that is a very big pro because whenever you add an additional div, if the styling is not being done correctly, then it could be that this additional div actually destroys something. So those additional divs should be prevented, and for that you should use the decoration tag. You can actually configure what the decoration tag is. It does not necessarily have to be a div, so it can be any other element, basically. But of course, there's always a con. So the con in this case is that the decoration tag is less obvious to see in the code. So you have to be a little bit more careful and have to inspect the component more closely to really see, okay, does it have a decoration tag, yes or not, because it's not immediately visible in the HTML script. Finally, coming to the component context epilog, although this is the crucial part, it's actually very simple on how this is being constructed. It is a custom element named CQ, and it contains 2 different attributes. One attribute encodes, okay, what is the actual path in the repository you want to edit whenever you touch something about this component, and also which is being used as a basis for rendering, so really the context of this component. And the other one contains all the meta information which are relevant for editing. And the second part is especially crucial for rendering the front end. So whenever you have some problem with that, I can really recommend to have a closer look at the markup to see whether it really contains all the relevant parts in there.
Okay, so I guess many of us has ever faced one of these 2 problems that we outlined at the beginning. One is that you cannot edit your component at all. You cannot open your dialog, so you say, hey, what's going on here? Or the other common error is that this overlay that is meant to be used to edit your component is not in the right position or is has the wrong sizing. Okay, so in order to solve this issue, we need to first understand how the Touch UI rendering works and what are the elements relevant to it. So, well, first the overlay. So that's everybody know what the overlay is? No, anybody? Okay. Yeah. Well, the overlay is this blue square that is over your component that allows you to edit the information or the content of the component. Okay. So let's see how AEM create these overlays. So basically, every component that you have in your page in the editor mode has an editable object related to it. Okay. So this editable object is basically like the way that we have in the client side to modify our component. Okay, we can think of it like the model of the component in the client side. Okay, so every editable has associated an overlay. Okay, and this overlay is this blue line that we already showed, and this is very important to solve our first issue that we mentioned, and is that the overlay sometimes disappears or the overlay has wrong sizing or position. Okay, this is a very common. So basically what the overlay class is doing is that it's looking for the CQ element that Konrad mentioned before that has this special information, and when it found the CQ element, it's gonna look for the parent of this element. Okay, so it could be either the decoration tag if it's being used, or just the surrounding div of the component where the component is being called. Okay, so this is very important. Sometimes we don't know this, and the parent of this CQ component. CQ element, is a div like it's floating or has an absolute position or something like that. And there is when we miss this overlay. Okay, so again, you already know how to solve this issue. So next time you look for the CQ element and look for the parent of it. Okay. Okay. So how many front-end are here? Oh, many. Good. I guess many of you have faced these two problems. Yes, that we need to render, or we need to render our component in a different way between edit mode or preview mode, or that we need to refresh or initialize our JavaScript components when we submit the dialog because we change the information of the component itself. Okay, so in order to solve these two issues, we need to understand how the Touch UI architecture works. Okay, so basically the Touch UI is built using two frames. One is the outer frame, which is the editor frame, where all of the overlays, toolbars, dialogues are going on, and inside is the inner frame, which is the content frame. The content frame has the actual content of your component. Is all the script that you build for your component and it's being rendered in the content. Okay, so these two separate frames need a way to communicate to each other. Okay, so AEM use the post message method to do this, but they do it in a fancier way, let's say. So there is a message channel implemented by AEM, which is basically a class with a little helpers using this post message method to communicate, to either send or receive messages from one frame to another. Okay, so the message channel has there is an object for the message channel in both frames, so you can either send messages or subscribe to messages, either from the editor frame or the content frame. Okay, so these are the objects that you can use to create this communication. There are three methods for this, three functions for this. Communication, which is very basic, let's say, is to subscribe to the message, to unsubscribe to the message, or to send information to the other frame, to emit the message. Okay, so there are different messages going on between these two frames, but these are the two that we think are the more important and more relevant. The first one is the replace message, which is triggered every time you do a modification in your component that is going to affect the content of your component. Let's say if you are more text, you are an image, you replace a class or something like that. There is a replace message being sent from the editor frame to the content frame, and this message carries also the new content of your component. Okay, so the replace message is being triggered basically when you submit the dialog or when you finish editing an inline component. Also, the other important message is the toggle class. This toggle class is being triggered or sent to the other frame when the user switch or between one layer and another. Let's say when we switch from edit mode to preview mode. Okay, so there is this toggle class which is basically that's telling the content frame to change the class of the HTML parent. Okay, so how this information is going to help us to solve the problem? Well, basically what we did is that we create a very simple lifecycle, let's say, for JavaScript components. When we create or we trigger two messages. One is to init the component or destroy the component. Okay. So the init component is being triggered in the content frame every time that there is a dialog submission. When we enable a layer, so enabling a layer is when you basically when you switch from edit to preview mode, the preview layer is being enabled. Okay, or when you have a page load in publish or with the WC mode disabled. Okay, so this is gonna trigger an init component event. And the destroy component is basically only triggered when you disable a layer, okay? So, for instance, when you switch from preview to edit mode, then there is a disable, a destroy component message being triggered by the preview layer, okay?
So let me elaborate a bit on why we developed this library in the first place. So what Adobe is still recommending is actually only really working in the classic UI. So you probably know the CQ listener attribute in the edit config, and you leverage that to actually trigger some JavaScript on certain events. And I'll come to that in a second, why this should no longer be used in the touch UI. And that's the reason why. And actually, Adobe, even with AEM 6.4, does not provide a proper API to hook into that, to cover those pretty common cases, I would say, for example, to render differently depending on the mode, or to reinitialize JavaScript components really after submitting the dialog. So in most of the cases, you probably just use the workaround to refresh the whole page, which is using the hammer. This is the more intelligent solution, obviously, which is also more performant. Good. So let's come to some configuration aspects of components, some general remarks before I close with best practices. So the edit config is the most important part of the component where you configure editing behavior of it, or where you can tweak editing behavior of it. And this thing is being configured in a subnode of the actual component, which is called CQ edit config. And I just want to highlight one thing here. So CQ listeners is probably the most common place why you need that in the first place. This is no longer true because CQ listeners, as I said, it allows you basically to hook into those events, but they have three drawbacks, very severe drawbacks with the touch UI. First of all, those events are being fired in the outer frame. So in most of the cases, you're interested really to have that in the inner frame because you cannot really access the DOM from the outer frame, right? So you see markup of irrelevant DOM, basically. So that's why they only provide very simple predefined methods to refresh certain parts of the page. It doesn't make too much sense. The second issue with that is with the touch UI, it's always being triggered in addition to the default thing, which is actually always being executed. So the default behavior of the touch UI is actually to re-render only the component with the AJAX call and inject that snippet, which is being re-rendered into the inner frame. And then the inner frame takes that snippet and is replacing that in the DOM. That is the default behavior. In most of the cases, this is desired and good enough, but not in all. And this default behavior you cannot prevent from happening with that mechanism, CQ listeners. And the reason for that is that this is happening asynchronously. So the CQ listeners use a promise internally. So you cannot really tell whether your listener is acting first or the default behavior is acting first. And this is really dangerous. I first observed that when I saw, okay, in the network tab, the component is actually being rendered twice or being requested twice via AJAX. So this is obviously not good. One thing which is maybe not that well known is that by default, the properties of the edit config are not being merged with the one from the super component. I don't know why Adobe took that decision. It's, in my opinion, bad and wrong. So we all would expect that this is being merged with all the properties from the parent component, because in most of the cases you only want to override a certain property and all the other properties are still relevant also in the child component, right? But there is a way around that. So there's a certain property where you can say, okay, I want to actually inherit. So you can switch to the more reasonable default behavior. This was already covered in the previous talk by Natalia, but very briefly only. So I want to give you a quick hint on the actual proxy pattern which is being recommended by Adobe. So Adobe says, please do not use our WCM core components as is, but always have a proxy layer in between. And the proxy layer could either act on site level, tenant level, or even customer level, depending on your requirements. It doesn't really matter. So what does it mean, actually? So I picked an arbitrary customer. So it was Allianz in this case. So let's see. Let's imagine we have one page, and the page is using an image component, a very basic one. So we could have used the WCM core image component because we are fine with that and the customer does not have any additional demands. But we are agile, right? We learned about that already. So the customer is actually changing his mind and basically wants to have some extension, some fancy one, I don't know. I cannot come up with a good one right now, but it's a fancy one, which is not being supported by the WCM core component. And what you would need to do right now is you would need to derive from that component. So you would need maybe to come up with your own scripting language. But this is actually not enough because all the content which has been created before is bound to the wrong component here. And this is exactly what the proxy pattern means and what is good for. So it always prevents us from having to do a content migration. So basically, this connection would need to be migrated. So all the pages leveraging the old component would need to be touched to change the resource type to point to this one here. So this is a breaking change. So we want to prevent that. How do we do that? We use a proxy component in the first place, even if there is not really a demand to derive from a functionality perspective from the core component. But it can happen anytime in the future, right? So be prepared for that. This happens, really. Some more words on component inheritance, because component inheritance became also more important with the advent of WCM core components, because actually Adobe is saying you have to use component inheritance with the proxy components whenever you want to leverage our components. And the basic thing is that also here inheritance was not really done 100% correctly by Adobe, unfortunately. So what you see in here is that inheritance is actually not inheriting all the stuff from the parent, but only certain stuff. So the most important ones are definitely scripts, so that works fine, okay. Dialogues works fine as well. It's even better because dialogues are being merged on a property level, so you don't need to override fully, but you can say, okay, I want to add only one tab or only one component, so that is possible out of the box. Thumbnails, icons work perfectly fine. CQ-edit config with the limitation that by default it does not merge, but you can change that. But all the other properties are actually not being inherited, and that is obviously not a very wise choice from Adobe, especially when you think about something like CQ template. You know what that is used for? So this acts as a prototype whenever you create the component by dropping it, for example, into a parser. So this really says, okay, this is the initial values or the initial content my component should have. And that important part is being used in the WCM core component. It's being configured in the CQ template. But when you have your proxy component in between, you lose that because you no longer see that CQ template. So for now, the solution is unfortunately copy and paste. Very sad. I have a ticket open. It's not yet fixed with 6.4 though. Yeah, but still the best practice is you start with almost empty proxies and then you evolve them over time. So almost empty, yeah, as I said. Not everything can be left out, unfortunately. So coming to some best practices. Of course, I'm open for discussion. Those are my recommendations, so they're very opinionated. Feel free to challenge me. So some of them I already mentioned. I just listed them here for completeness. So you should only really use edit config if really necessary. I know that most of the development starts like that. I just copy over an existing component. If that by coincidence has a CQ edit config, then I have one as well. Though copy and paste is not being recommended. So you should really understand, okay, what is each file doing in the component node, right? If you really need to have a CQ edit config, then what you should consider is you don't use CQ listeners. I said that already. The other important property or subnode on that level is CQ actions. So CQ actions determine, okay, what kind of icons, what kind of items appear in the edit bar. So whether I'm able to delete the component, for example. And the basic recommendation is also you should not use that. And the reason for that is that the CQ actions are more determined by the container component than by the actual component you're defining in here. Just a very simple example is the delete action. So the delete action makes perfect sense when you use the component directly in a parser because you want to be able to remove that component again. It does not make any sense when this is a fixed component in a composite component, right? So in that case, you always want to have that component and you don't want to give the editor the possibility to delete it because there's no way to recreate it. And the last point is set CQ inherit to true to have the anticipated regular merging behavior with a parent. Some more practices. So the WCM core components. I personally suffered from that a lot because I was kind of an early adopter, I guess. I reported almost 17 bugs. Most of them have been fixed in the meanwhile. So in the meanwhile, we do have release 2.0. Even release 2.0 is compatible with 6.3. So, and they stick to that, and they basically maintain the compatibility in the future. And there's even a hotfix coming up, 2.02, which is supposed to fix also some severe bugs and regressions which are in there also in 2.0. I mean, Adobe is not perfect, we all know that. Still, if you come up with your own component, you will do a lot more bugs. And it's open source, you can contribute, you can do pull requests, you can fix that code, and they're pretty often releases. So really the recommendation from right now is whenever you start a new project, rely on those components, please. Yeah, the second point is closely related to that, actually. So you need to use, obviously, component inheritance when you rely on the WCM core components because you have to use proxies. There are also some other cases where inheritance would be useful. I've seen a lot of code where just copy and paste has been used in the past. So think about, okay, is my component close to another component? Can I use inheritance? If I can't use inheritance, can I maybe use composite pattern to just combine that out of several other components I do already have? And this is related to the CQ listeners part. So what you should come up with is a more intelligent handling in terms of JavaScript components which need to reinitialize in some way in case, for example, the content has been changed or in case the mode is being switched. Don't just refresh the page. This is a very poor editor experience because it just takes a lot of time. And the last one, I guess the last one, is use decoration tags because that way you minimize the overhead of additional diffs. So in the best case, you really end up with a markup which is very close to what has been delivered from a third-party agency, right? One example in here to make that more explicit. So this is basically, again, the example from the beginning. So the WCM core title component. So the title component contains several classes. And the first two classes are actually coming from the component configuration. So they configured the decoration tag and said, okay, my configuration tag should always have those classes. And the other classes come basically from the container. And the advantage is here, they're both combined in the same div. So no need for additional divs here, just for styling and for layouting purposes. And one last hint, this is a little bit repeating what Natalia already said. I still want to mention that explicitly. There is very often the demand of influencing components depending on the context. This gets complex, right? So try to prevent that whenever possible. This is not always possible, I know that. So there are certain ways which you can, or actually there's only, in my mind, there's only one way on how you should do that in case you have really the demand of having two or multiple different variants of the same component, which, and the variants are not determined by the editor himself, but rather by the context or by the container. So I think this is very common. And instead of duplicating the code, duplicating the components, which you could do, you should come up with a more intelligent mechanism. And the more intelligent mechanism is actually content policies. So please use content policies. And content policies is not a new concept. So for all of those which have experience with older versions of CQ, there has always been the design mode. And the design mode was exactly that. It allowed you basically to configure some values depending on the context. And this is the only recommended way to really parameterize components and say, okay, I have variant A or variant B. There are other ways I've seen in the past, and basically those ways I all don't really recommend for several reasons. So one way is using also content properties via CQ template, but those content policies are not reachable via the edit dialog. So that comes with a severe drawback that whenever you change that parameterization for some reason after content has been created, you need to have content migration. Not recommended, especially not for larger enterprises where thousands of pages have been created. The second
yeah, the second anti-pattern, I would say, is use request-based options. So there are two different options I know of. Maybe you know of some other. So one is request attributes. This has been introduced with AEM 6.3. This is an option you can use on data slide resource. And this allows you basically to inject arbitrary request attributes, which can be evaluated then in the script afterwards, so also in the component. And the big disadvantage here is that those request attributes are obviously not there in case you submit the dialog. Because if the editor submits the dialog, then there's an AJAX request directly targeting the component, so not really considering the container where the request attribute has been set. So the container is kind of skipped. So in this case, you don't have the request attribute, and therefore, obviously, you lose your parametrization. The same for selector. Selector is basically just a special request attribute, which has been used a lot in the past, especially previously to the advent of AEM 6.3. If there's only one thing I want you to remember, then it is this. All the stuff I've talked about is really poorly documented on the Adobe side, unfortunately, right? So if you just Google for that, you might find other information, wrong information, or no information. So to prevent that, please look up and leverage the search in our wiki, because I tried to document all those hidden features in nice wiki pages. And please contribute and comment on that in case you find wrong information there. But the thing really is I document that stuff not because I have too much free time, but really because it's documented nowhere else. That's the only reason, right?